A diagnosis of schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or brief psychotic disorder can be a confusing and frightening thing. You may not understand what your diagnosis means, how to manage it, or what will happen next. But we are here to help you. Let's begin by first understanding what your diagnosis means, how it manifests, and how to understand the difference between each disorder. For this presentation, we will use the analogy of building a sandwich. There are many different types of sandwiches out there, and each with their own components. First, you begin with your basic fillers, your proteins. In the case of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, your basic fillers are your psychotic symptoms. In order to be diagnosed, you must have at least one of the essential proteins: ham, hallucinations; turkey, delusions; or roast beef, disorganized speech. You could, however, also have other symptoms, like bacon, disorganized behavior, or you could add some condiments like mayonnaise, ranch dressing, mustard, and so on. These are your negative symptoms. One way to remember what can be considered psychotic symptoms is to use the acronym HDBS network, or High Definition Bull Snot Network. High definition because your symptoms may seem very real and very strong to you. Bull snot because they really are not real. And the N in network stands for negative symptoms. To remember what negative symptoms are, we can use the 5 A's: affect, ambivalence, alogia, anhedonia, and asociality. Negative symptoms are symptoms that are lacking something that is normally there. Affect is the lack of emotional expression. Ambivalence is the lack of decision-making. Alogia is the lack of speech, or mutism. Anhedonia is the lack of pleasure in things that would normally bring you pleasure. And asociality is the lack of ability to relate to others. Sometimes we like a little cheese on our sandwich. Cheese, in this case, will represent our mood symptoms. American cheese for our depressive symptoms, and pepper jack for our manic symptoms. Not every sandwich has cheese, which can indicate a different diagnosis. More on that later. Every sandwich needs a grain to complete it. The grain, in this case, will indicate the duration of symptoms. Short-term symptoms will be represented by a simple wrap or tortilla. Chronic or long-term symptoms are represented by slices of bread. Sometimes a sandwich is not actually a sandwich. Sometimes it's a burger. Sometimes our symptoms can be explained by something other than a psychotic disorder. They may be related to medication or substance use. They could be the effects of another medical condition or even another mental health disorder. It is important to rule out all burgers before making a diagnosis. Let's talk about the different kinds of sandwiches and how we can determine what kind they are. Schizophrenia is a sandwich that has at least 2 fillers. At least one must be one of your essentials: ham, turkey, or roast beef. Schizophrenia does not have any cheese, no mood symptoms, and this sandwich is made with bread. It is long-term. The mnemonic we can use to remember this is 2 for schizophrenia, which means you must have at least 2 symptoms for at least 6 months for a diagnosis of schizophrenia. An example of someone who qualifies for a diagnosis of schizophrenia is someone who has experienced auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and anhedonia over the course of 14 months. A ham and turkey sandwich with mayo on rye bread. Again, we must also rule out any burgers. Schizoaffective disorder includes your cheese, or mood symptoms. Your cheese and your proteins need to be together in the same sandwich, but you must also experience a tortilla wrap with just protein for at least 2 weeks in order to qualify for schizoaffective disorder. If there are no tortilla wraps with just protein, you could actually qualify for a mood disorder diagnosis with psychotic features. The presence of the protein-only tortilla wraps is essential. One way to remember the qualifiers for schizoaffective disorder is the acronym HATS. H stands for half. meaning more than half the time during the duration of the illness, you must experience mood symptoms, your American or pepper jack cheese, depressive or manic symptoms. A stands for alone, which means psychotic symptoms must occur alone for at least 2 weeks, your tortilla wrap with protein only. T stands for together, meaning mood and psychotic symptoms must occur at the same time, cheese and protein together. And S stands for substances, which means ruling out any substance use or other medical conditions, ruling out all the burgers. A brief psychotic disorder is just a simple tortilla wrap. You must have at least one filler, and at least one of those must be one of your essential proteins, your ham, turkey, or roast beef. And your symptoms will only last up to a month, but at least for 1 day. There is no cheese, and as usual, we must rule out any burgers. An example of someone who qualifies for a brief psychotic disorder diagnosis is someone who has experienced word salad and irrational behavior over the course of 2 weeks, a tortilla wrap with roast beef and bacon. Let's move on to a discussion about treatment options. A diagnosis of schizophrenia or psychotic disorder may seem scary, but there are options for effective treatment. To continue our analogy of sandwiches, let's discuss treatments in terms of how we wrap up our sandwiches. One treatment option is medication. Just like our typical paper wrap, medications are standard and often reliable treatment options. The most standard treatment for schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders is antipsychotics. First-generation antipsychotics are dopamine antagonists, but the more typically prescribed antipsychotics are the second-generation kind, which are serotonin-dopamine antagonists. Aside from antipsychotics, there are also mood stabilizers, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and benzodiazepines that could also be prescribed. Some things you need to consider before beginning a medication treatment plan are whether or not your insurance will cover it, or which medications they will cover. If insurance does not cover a specific medication or only part of a medication, then you will need to consider the cost of that medication. Various medications will vary in cost, and you may need to discuss the options that will fit into your budget. You will also need to note that for many medication plans, there will be a trial and error period, where you will need to try different medications at different doses before you find what works best for you. This may take some time, and some medications will prove not to be effective at all. There are also side effects to consider for each medication, and you may need to have a discussion about what long-term effects each medication will have or their long-term efficacy. Getting your sandwich in a to-go box can make sure your sandwich lasts longer and is further protected from the elements. Psychosocial treatments are known to be effective long-term and are often paired with other treatments such as medications. You can look into individual psychotherapy or meeting with a therapist regularly for sessions. However, there are also social skills training, family therapy to help assist your support system, and vocational rehabilitation or supportive employment options, depending on the severity the effects of your symptoms have had on your occupational life. Some things to consider when discussing psychosocial options include, again, whether your insurance will cover these options or whether they will fit into your budget. You will also need to consider your long-term commitment to therapy. Psychosocial therapies such as psychotherapy may not yield immediate results, but tend to be more effective over time. The slower success of these treatment plans may prove frustrating or endless at first. Another option to consider is the typical paper bag. It can be necessary at times when you need something quick and effective. However, it is temporary. Sometimes, depending on the situation, hospitalization can be considered a viable option for treatment. Sometimes we may experience an unexpected crisis. We can lose our jobs, our homes, even a loved one. Sometimes our cars break down and the repairs are outside of what we can afford. Sometimes we have an encounter with a hostile individual or someone who is just plain mean and harmful. There are many situations that can cause an emergency for us, and managing symptoms of schizophrenia or a psychotic disorder can prove too much when this happens. Hospitalization can then be an option to consider until we can work through the crisis. Sometimes our symptoms can just be too severe for us to manage on our own. This would be another situation where we may consider hospitalization. Or maybe we're just having trouble taking care of ourselves while we figure out what treatment plan is going to be the most effective long term. During this time, we may have trouble remembering to eat right, get enough sleep, take a shower, brush our teeth, wash our clothes, and so on. A hospital stay can be a way for us to ensure our basic needs are met until we can get a better handle on our symptoms and find a permanent treatment plan. There are things to consider, of course, with a hospital stay, especially a longer stay. Again, you need to consider what your insurance will cover and what you can afford. But you also need to understand how a strange environment that is not your home will affect you. Sometimes a more familiar surrounding will be better for you. And you will also need to prepare yourself for the limitations hospitalization entails. Your friends and family will have limited visitation time, and you yourself will be limited on your personal freedom, where you can go and when, and what you will be allowed to do while you are staying there. There are always alternative options. Just like we can always put our sandwich into a plastic bag to save it for later, there are alternative treatments that can be considered if the typical treatments are not working. One alternative is electroconvulsive therapy. This is often a treatment option for adults who do not respond to medications. Again, you will need to consider the cost of such a treatment and whether or not your insurance will cover it. And, as with many other treatment options, it may not be effective, and there may be side effects to consider. A diagnosis of schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or brief psychotic disorder can be overwhelming, but it is important for you to know that you will not have to take this journey alone. You will have a team of people to help you and assist you. This team can include medical and mental health professionals and any variety of friends, family, and community members that you can turn to for resources and assistance. The larger and more expansive your team, the more successful you are going to be at managing your symptoms and living the life that you want to live. So, our next step will be to help you build that team. Let's begin today.